The indigenous education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is the practice of multi-interaction arrangements between human environment and non-human environment. The lifestyle, roles, and responsibilities of indigenous identities are embodiments of traditional indigenous education, just as how education occurs by living the lifestyles. The cores of indigenous educations are the traditional knowledge which explain ecological food chains, and the protocols of respect that have existed between human and non-human entities of the Earth's ecosystem. These cores could be traced back to the dream time, that temporal and actual world before the time began when the land was formed and the spirits roamed free. All are orally passed down from generation to generation, often through song and dance performance. Music and dance in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are key means of communicating and experiencing spirituality. Their performance becomes a form of collective self-actualization. It is through the singing of ancient sacred songs and the dance performance that accompanies them demonstrate their respect for the land and country. Music and dance provide understandings of how the practices of historically traditional indigenous lifestyles logically protect and sustain a continuum of mutual respect between human and non-human. Thus, in Aboriginal culture, song and dance become the means of the transmission of history, allowing a complex system of knowledge and identities to be passed through the generations and to survive. In 1770, the British Admiralty gave secret instructions to Lieutenant James Cook to obtain the consent of the natives to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain on his voyages to the South Pacific between 1768 and 1779. Despite of the signs that the land was inhabited, Cook did not create a treaty with indigenous people. On the 26th of January 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip claimed sovereignty and ownership of the land through the legal concept of terra nullius, a Latin term which means a land belonging to no one. Aboriginal land was declared as an empty land in spite of the fact that there were tribes with a total population of at least 300,000, perhaps as many as 1 million. No one knew exactly because the first Australians were not counted as human beings. At the beginning of colonization in 1788, thousands of indigenous people continually resisted the violation of their right to land and its impact on indigenous cultures and communities. It is estimated that at least 20,000 Aboriginal people were killed as a direct result of colonial violence during this era. In the 10 years that followed, 90% of indigenous population was reduced because of the introduction of new diseases such as influenza, venereal disease, typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, measles, and whooping cough. Second, the dispossession of indigenous lands, and third, direct and violent conflicts such as frontier wars and massacres. When the British colonized Australia in the late 18th century, part of the non-material baggage that accompanied them was a conventional view of the superiority of the white race. Australian Aboriginals were viewed as the most wretched, primitive, and miserable race on Earth. The profound belief in the racial cultural superiority of the colonizing civilization and people acts as a legitimation for exploitative policies and practices toward aborigines, such as that of exclusionism, dispossession, and extermination that result to the transfer of the ownership of indigenous lands to English settlers. Prior to colonization, Australian indigenous people had around 250 different dialects that were actively silenced by government policies and Christian missions. From 1840s through 1970s, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people were subjected to slavery. And in the first half of the 20th century, until the 1960s, the Australian government sought to create a single uniform white Australian culture through the introduction of assimilation policies. The assimilation policies separated indigenous people from white society by placing them on reserves and missions. Also, under the assimilation policies, generations of indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families, and this has become known as the stolen generations. In 1967, 90.7% of the Australian population voted yes to change the negative references of the Constitution towards Aboriginal and Torres Islander people and to count Indigenous Australians in the census. One of the most important outcomes of the 1967 referendum was to provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a symbol of recognition. The recognition of inequalities and a given power to the Australian government to address discrimination and inequalities gave the 1967 referendum long-standing significance.
Today, the Government of Australia will move the following motion of apology in the Parliament of Australia. We come together today to deal with an ugly chapter in our nation's history. And we come together today to offer our nation's apology. To say to you, the forgotten Australians, and those who were sent to our shores as children without their consent, that we are sorry.
This marked a pivotal moment in the healing journey of many Stolen Generation members. The Bringing Them Home report created several positive changes. It allowed Stolen Generations members to put their stories on the public record and led to the wave of apologies by state parliaments, judges, churches, civic associations, trade unions, and the Australian government. The apology of the Australian government served as a first step of reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians. In 2008, the Australian government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people agreed to work together to achieve equality in health status and life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians by the year 2030. To demonstrate the commitment of the Australian government to achieve health equality for Indigenous Australians within 25 years, the government established Closing the Gap, a strategy that aims to reduce disadvantage among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with respect to life expectancy, child mortality, access to early childhood education, educational achievement, and employment outcomes. In 2014, under the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, the government provided more than $1.3 billion to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from their early childhood years through primary and secondary education, to post-school qualification, and into the workforce. Evidence shows that around 20% of the gap in school performance between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians is explained by lower school attendance. The Remote School Attendance Strategy, or RSAS, was established in 2014 to enhance the school attendance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in remote areas. RSAS currently operates in 78 sites in the Northern Territory, New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, and South Australia. RSAS officers work with communities to develop a local plan to get students go to school every day. In 2015, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Languages Framework was added to the Australian curriculum to provide a way forward for all schools in Australia to support the teaching and learning for Indigenous languages. However, research indicates that classroom teachers devote less than 5 minutes per week to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curriculum, which suggests that there's still a lot to be done to ensure that all Australian students are engaged in reconciliation, respect, and recognition of the world's oldest continuous living cultures. In the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, the government announced to provide $138 million to inspire, assist, and provide access to education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. That includes a $25 million fund to prepare students for science, technology, engineering, and math or STEM careers, $15 million towards a girls' STEM academy, and $60 million for mentoring and support services. $41 million will go to activities specific to women and girls, and $40 million will go to the Clontarf Foundation to support young men in secondary school academies. In recognition of the cultural history and distinct way of living of the First Nation, this community group already has an existing education system that was established thousands of years before the white settlement. The objectives of the Closing the Gap strategies and the massive funding of the government for the education of First Nation people are all based on the social concepts of white standards. What is education and how should it be? Why is it important? It disregarded the value and importance of the educational system and living standards of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Social workers should create a community awareness regarding the equal rights of the First Nation to practice and preserve their personal way of living and cultural identity. In 2015, the Australian government demonstrated its acknowledgement towards Aboriginal culture by including the First Nation languages in the Australian curriculum. The situation suggests that the problem is not only with the government, but it is within the whole Australian society. Thus, a collective movement that fosters the human rights of the First Nation is needed to ensure the engagement of the whole Australian community, to ensure that Aboriginal living and culture is recognized not only in schools and other public settings, but it is recognized by every Australian family.